Hello again. In this one, what we're going to talk about is the imposition of tariffs or quotas in our market with imports, because it's the importing country with the incentive to do these things. The reason is that they may do these things. There are several. Um, one that I personally feel is kind of the best reason to do these things is the national defense argument. Um, I think that's kind of become more apparent in recent times than it used to be in the past. You see, if a country has comparative advantage in the production of oil or energy, speaking broadly, relative to the domestic country, according to our theory of comparative advantage, it would be wise to have that country do the production of oil or energy, and for the country without that comparative advantage to focus on its resources and specialize in the things that it has comparative advantage in. The trouble with that can be that once you're dependent on another country for your source of energy, you've relinquished power to that country and your country's sovereignty, because it's such an integral part of a country's economy, um, and standard of living. So things like that you tend to want to produce domestically, even if you don't have comparative advantage. And one way to raise domestic production and decrease imports of something like that is by a quota or tariff, or a quota of zero imports if you just don't allow it to be made abroad. Um, this has really come sort of in more of a light in the past few years with coronavirus and then the war in the Ukraine, because um, the national defense argument has turned out to be something that may be applicable more broadly than just oil as it traditionally has been applied. Semiconductors, it turns out, are a major important input in our economy. And when supply chains were disrupted and something that we had other countries making for us, semiconductors, because apparently they have comparative advantage in the production of it, became less available. And this has had rippling effects through our economy because those things go into so many electrical devices and automobiles. Um, I think in hindsight, we might say, boy, I wish we hadn't imported so much of our semiconductor production, because the adverse effects it's had on our economy to not be able to get it from abroad. That's that would be the application of the national defense argument in a way that is pretty new. Um, Similarly, uh, Germany and I believe France as well became dependent on Russia for their oil production because they have sought to have their domestic energy production be all green, and but continued to need oil, so they just had that entirely coming from Russia, or nearly entirely coming from Russia. And then Russia did something that they didn't approve of. That was initially staging for the invasion of Ukraine. And France and Germany sought to dissuade Russia from doing that, but they had given up their bargaining chip because they were already dependent on Russia for their oil. So in a way, the bargaining chip was something they didn't have anymore, because the national defense argument goes hand in hand with that. Were dependent on them for an important thing in their economy. On the other hand, since Russia invaded the Ukraine, the United States has imposed, and the West of Europe has imposed strict sanctions on Russia, meaning that they will not trade with Russia while this is going on. And that's a bargaining chip because they could lift those sanctions to restore trade relations if Russia were to comply with the wishes of the West. So, or Western Europe and the United States. So those two arguments. Those are reasons to impose quotas or tariffs in international trade. But I'd say really the biggest argument that causes these things to happen. And just by the way, economists generally favor free trade for the reasons that we discussed in chapters 3, and then using the model in chapter 2 as well. We could see how trade could make everyone better off. So economists generally favor free trade. In perpetuity, there's opposition to free trade because of this argument. That's the jobs argument. You see, if your country doesn't have comparative advantage in the production of a good, and you're going to have another country specialize and make that good while you specialize in the goods the services where you do have comparative advantage, the people who work in the industries where we don't have comparative advantage will lose their jobs because that good's not going to be made domestically anymore. Now we know, because we explored this in chapter 3 and we've explored this with our model, net the country is better off. But that doesn't mean that everyone in the country is better off, as we've also explored. And so there's always a push against free trade because the industries where there's not comparative advantage will lose to trade, even though the net gains from trade exceed those losses. So the jobs argument is very compelling, particularly when you can take a picture and put it in a newspaper or on a TV news piece of an abandoned factory. It's a very compelling visualization. It's very stirring. It's hard to take a picture of the gains from trade, that little, that D that we just drew in that gain in consumer surplus from imports. It's hard to make that as moving as a picture of an empty factory or people packing up and leaving when they're laid off. And so the jobs argument becomes a very powerful argument. Other arguments for the government to intervene in free trade are like the infant industry argument. And the argument there is, well, we will have comparative advantage if we just allow our industry to get established here. So we're going to protect our industry by imposing tariffs or quotas. And then once it's established, we'll remove those because we'll have comparative advantage. The trouble with that is once they're imposed, they tend not to ever be removed because those industries don't want to see them removed, because then they would have to compete on the world stage, and that's harder at the world price than it is at the trade protected price. So that's the challenge with that. I'd say a similar argument is the anti-dumping argument, or the text calls it the competitive practices argument or something like that. The argument here is that, this country is subsidizing the industry where they say they have comparative advantage. The government is subsidizing that industry, so their costs of production are lower in that industry. If the government weren't subsidizing it over there, they would not have comparative advantage in it. So we're going to impose tariffs here to restrict the imports of that, because they don't really have comparative advantage. If it were a level playing field, we would have comparative advantage and we would be making it. So we're going to impose these tariffs for that reason. And so that's why I think it's kind of similar to the infant industry argument. The trouble with that one is, first of all, the country that's saying that may also be subsidizing industries of their own. That tends to be the case, I believe. And then the other one is that it may be sensationalizing. There may be sensationalization of that argument, of the dumping argument or the subsidy argument on the other side of the ocean, for the purpose of really the jobs argument, because the industries who don't have comparative advantage have incentive to make every argument possible to protect themselves, and it doesn't always necessarily mean that what we hear is an accurate depiction of what's going on, I feel. So those are the reasons that we might impose these tariffs or quotas. So now let's get to what they look like in the market and what they do to the market. So here's our market. Now this is the before, because now we have the importation happening. In the other market where we looked at imports, in the other model, that was when we brought in trade. We allowed trade. So now we're there. So now this is the world price. Consumers are enjoying all of this surplus. And then the sellers, I didn't have my C written on here, are enjoying this surplus. So this is total surplus right here, this full shape. And the other market and the other model that included that D, because we were showing how it added to have this. Now it's added in and it's A, B, and C. But for any of those arguments that we just mentioned, or for the purpose that I didn't mention of simply the government collecting revenue, because let's define what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax on imports. The first taxes permitted by the federal government of the United States were tariffs. And it was for the purpose of raising revenue. So that might be the reason to do it right there. I don't think that is so much anymore, but it might be. Because, hey, you know, why tax domestic production and jobs? Let's tax somewhere else. Of course, it will result in the same thing we're showing. It sounds nice, but it will result in these outcomes that we're going to show here. But for any of those reasons, we're going to impose a tax or a tariff on imports. So that means that now the price that will be faced by the market will be the world price plus the tariff. So I'm going to put a T there for tariff. And let's say that's here. Well, let's see what that new price means. Clearly B is getting cut. Now the price is going to be here. So these consumers are out of the market. Right along here, they're gone. So B just got moved to this smaller portion here. At this price, the consumers are willing and able to consume only this much. A smaller amount because it's a higher price. Law of demand and the demand curve predict that. At this higher price, the sellers are willing and able to sell more than they were at the world price. So this goes up, this comes down, imports fall. But hey, that was the idea. This gap now is imports. Right here. And I'm slopping up my notation down there. Well, if they're charging a tax or a tariff on imports, this area right here, this rectangle, the area of that represents the government's revenue. And that is, I'm going to stick with the same letters that are in the textbook, letter E. So we know that E, after the tax, is going to be government revenue. Let's think about what happened here. It used to be, with the world price being here, only these sellers along here enjoyed seller surplus. They were able to produce the good that they would have produced such a small amount at this price, let's say, but they got to enjoy this price. So all of this C used to be seller surplus, but now the price is going to be clear up here. So there'll be people who weren't in the selling market, weren't sellers before, who can step in and sell at this higher price. So then this becomes interesting, the text changed it. This is how the text did it, I'm sorry. But this becomes C and this becomes G. That's the way using the text, same notation. So this amount, it's what I said of it is still accurate. That's what the sellers could sell at lower prices, but they didn't have to. Now there's even more of that. So G plus C becomes seller surplus afterwards. And that additional amount right there, this is the real motivation in most cases to do it. It's those sellers who are lobbying for this change to happen to gain that. So G plus C is equal to seller surplus after. Now we have two other triangles not at all identified with any letters yet. That is here and here. See, these were part of the old B, right? They were part of consumer surplus. They're gone. This went to the government. This went to the sellers. These are gone. But they didn't go to anyone. They're just gone. And so that's what we call deadweight loss. And those, according to the book, using the same notation, are D and F. So afterwards, D plus F are equal to DWL, which stands for deadweight loss. It's an inefficiency. It's something, a gain that could be had that isn't going to be had. It's gone. And then what remains of consumer surplus is still A plus B. I wish the text, I would have used different notation. But it's smaller than it used to be. That's why I would have used different letters there. But I'm trying to keep it consistent, so if you're following along with figure 4, you'll get to the same, you'll arrive at the same outcome. But remember, that was all of this. Now it's just this. So we've taken from the consumers, and we've transferred part of it to the sellers, and part of it to the government, but part of it just went up in space or smoke. It's just gone with no one benefiting from it. And that's the problem from an economist's point of view, is these two triangles right here, for which people are made worse off without making anyone else better off. That's an inefficiency. And that's our model. That's why economists don't like it. And but that's also, as I mentioned before, that's all the reasons that we do it, or might do it. So that's all I have to say about that.